One cold, grey afternoon in the middle of winter, a small boy sat alone near the marshes. He was crying. That small boy was me, Philip Pirrip. As my name was difficult to say when I was small, my name became Pip. I was crying because it was Christmas Eve, and I was an orphan. My parents were dead, and so were 5 of my brothers and sisters. This happened when I was very young, so I did not remember them. I had lived with my sister and her husband, Joe Gargery, for most of my life. Joe was the village blacksmith, and Mrs. Joe was 20 years older than me. She was tall and thin and liked to complain about me. She was often angry, but Joe was my friend. On this grey afternoon, when I was about 7 years old, I had walked down to the graveyard at the edge of the village. I sat by my parents' grave as the afternoon light slowly disappeared. The marshes nearby became dark and frightening. I was going to leave and go home, when a terrible voice shouted, "Quiet!" Then a man appeared from behind a grave. I nearly jumped out of my skin. "What's your name, boy?" he shouted, walking slowly towards me. "Pip, sir." "Show me where you live," said the man. I pointed to my village, not far away. "Who do you live with?" "My sister, sir, Mrs. Joe Gargery. She's the wife of Joe Gargery, the blacksmith, sir." "A blacksmith?" The man looked down and I saw his leg irons. Then I noticed his old grey clothes and his thin, dirty face. He was shaking. "Do you know what a blacksmith's file is?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He suddenly grabbed my shoulders and shook me. "I want you to bring me that file early tomorrow morning, and some food too. Then I will let you live. What do you say?" I was frightened, so I promised to bring the file and the food to him the next day. "Now go home," he shouted. I ran until I could run no more. When I looked back, I saw the man far out on the marshes, a black shape against the angry red sky. Once I got my breath back, I hurried home as fast as I could. When I ran into the kitchen, feeling happy to be home safely, Mrs. Joe angrily asked me where I had been. "Only to the graveyard," I cried. "Graveyard!" she shouted. "You're lucky not to have been put in the graveyard long ago. It's because of me that you're still here. But I didn't want to look after you. It's bad enough being a blacksmith's wife. I never asked to be your mother." That evening I had work to do in the kitchen as usual. It was almost bedtime and I was helping to prepare lunch for the next day when I heard a loud noise. "Listen, what is that?" I said. "A convict escaped last night," Joe explained. "That noise was a warning to everyone in our village that another convict has got away." "From the prison ships," Mrs. Joe added. "What are they?" I asked. "They're ships where they put people because they have committed a crime," replied my sister. "Now go to bed," she shouted. I remembered that I had seen a broken old ship far out on the marshes that day. Perhaps it was a prison ship. As I fell asleep, I realised that the man I had met that day was one of the escaped convicts. He wanted a blacksmith's file so that he could take off his leg irons and get away from the marshes quickly. He scared me, but I also felt sorry for him. Early the next morning, I got up and went into the kitchen. It was Christmas Day, and guests were invited to dinner. There was some delicious cheese in the kitchen, as well as nuts, apples and oranges, and a cold meat pie. I took them all. Then I went into Joe's workroom and found a blacksmith's file. Closing the front door quietly behind me and holding all the food carefully, I set off. I ran to the graveyard and then out into the mist and over the wet marshes. Suddenly, quite by surprise, I saw a man in grey who seemed to be asleep. He wore leg irons and stood up when he saw me. At first, I thought he was the man that I knew, but then I realised that his face was different. He looked at me for a moment before disappearing into the mist. I wondered who he could be and what he was doing out here. Soon afterwards, I found the man I was looking for. I gave him the food at once, and he ate it quickly as I told him about the other man that I had just seen. He wanted to know who he was and where he had gone, but I could not tell him. Then, as soon as he had eaten, He took the file from me and started trying to remove his leg irons with an angry look on his face. I was afraid again, so I ran home as fast as I could. As I ran back across the marshes, I could hear the sound of the file on the ledge irons through the mist. Mrs. Joe was busy preparing the house for guests, so Joe and I were alone together. I began to feel guilty about the food and the file which I had stolen that morning, and I wanted to tell Joe what I had done. But then I thought he might not want to be my friend if I did, so I said nothing. It was not long before the guests arrived, and we sat down to Christmas dinner. At first, nobody noticed that anything was missing. But then, to my horror, Mrs. Joe invited everyone to try the delicious meat pie that Joe's uncle, Mr. Pumblechook, had given us. The guests happily agreed, and she went to find it. Joe told me I could have some, and I felt very bad. At any moment, Mrs. Joe was going to discover that the meat pie had disappeared from the kitchen. Unable to stay at the table with all the guests any longer, I got up from my chair and ran to the front door. But when I opened it, a group of soldiers entered, just as Mrs. Joe came back into the room shouting, "The pie has gone!" The appearance of a group of soldiers made the guests forget about the pie, and they all stood up from the table. Everyone wondered why the soldiers had come, and we all felt nervous. "We need a blacksmith to mend some handcuffs, please," the first soldier said. "We're looking for 2 convicts who broke their handcuffs and escaped. We think they are hiding out on the marshes, although they probably won't try to get away until tonight." When he asked if we had seen them, everybody else said no. I did not speak. Joe mended the handcuffs for the soldiers, and they waited with us as he worked. When they were finished, Joe and I followed the soldiers out of the village and onto the marshes. "I hope we don't find the convicts, Joe," said quietly. "Me too, Pip," Joe replied. Day became night as we walked over the marshes. It was raining and the wind blew the rain into our faces. Suddenly we heard angry shouts nearby. I was afraid of what was about to happen.